I'm deeply privileged, humbled, and honored to have the opportunity to engage you in this way. Though I have to say, I feel that my presence in this moment, in this context, in this space, puts me at something of an impossible position. For how can I hope to capture the civil rights legacy of a man whose life was the quintessential embodiment of civil rights? How can I hope to articulate the boundaries of King's civil rights commitments when those civil rights commitments knew no boundaries? How can I hope to evidence King's audacious optimism, his utter and complete belief in our individual and collective humanity against the background of a world in which acts of inhumanity are routinely normalized as inevitable features of social life? How can I respond not long in King's wonderful rhetorical register to his question about when we might see a world of racial justice, when the world of racial injustice continue to be a part of our everyday scene? And finally, how can I dream in King's vision when that vision was less of a dream and more of a moral and existential imperative that we as individuals, we as families, we as communities, we as a nation, and we as people of the world recognize that we cannot wait for civil rights, we cannot wait for freedom, and we cannot wait for justice? It's easy to rearticulate and recode the civil rights immediacies of today as social problems for tomorrow. It's easy to forget that the transformative possibilities of tomorrow are sown in the seeds of what we do today. The point then is not only that we cannot and should not wait, though that's surely an entailment of what I'm saying. It's also, and more crucially, that we cannot and should not ask subordinated, marginalized, disadvantaged communities to wait for tomorrow, for the justice they want, the justice they need, and the justice they deserve today. To paraphrase Dr. King, wait rings in the ears of every subordinating community with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see that justice delayed is justice denied. Now, I begin my comments in this way as something of a spoiler alert. Not the Game of Thrones winter is coming kind of spoiler alert, but the spoiler alert that puts into sharp relief that even as I'm deeply, deeply, deeply inspired by Dr. King, even as to utter his words is to experience a kind of civil rights jolt, I do not presume that my comments here today will do justice to his legacy. Indeed, I'm quite confident that they will not. Thus, I'm hoping that you will consider everything I've said thus far as a kind of prelude, a prelude that I hope you will understand as one massive caveat, to wit, that there is no filling the shoes of Dr. Martin Luther King. There is no account that can quite capture his visionary and courageous work towards instantiating a beloved community. King's sui generis stature in this respect was a function of neither infallibility nor perfection. It derived instead from a deep and abiding belief in the human spirit, and a willingness to see something, to say something, rather, when he saw something. Not in a state surveillance kind of way, but in a way that presumed that each one will bring one, in a way that presumed that everybody is somebody, in a way that presumed that we should lift every voice and sing, and in a way that presumed that we are each other's brothers, each other's sisters, each other's siblings in a collective project of peace, a collective project of love, and a collective project of social transformation. So what I thought I might do in the time that I have left is to riff on two insights that seems to have provided at least a partial explanation for some of Dr. King's civil rights engagements. One of these observations comes from King's letter from Birmingham jail. The relevant part of that letter reads something like this: how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I agree with St. Augustine then, an unjust law is no law at all. The insight here I think you already get, that law and morality are not the same thing, that legality and morality are not the same thing. From King's perspective, immoral laws should be deeply and robustly contested. The second insight comes from King's speech to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference at the 12th anniversary convention. In that context, King uttered, among other words, these: "I must confess, my friends, that the road ahead will not always be smooth. There will still be rocky places of frustration and meandering points of bewilderment. There will be inevitable stepbacks here and there. There will be those moments where the buoyancy of hope will be transferred into a fatigue of despair. Our dreams will sometimes be shattered and our ethereal hopes blasted. We men again, with tear-drenched eyes, have to stand before the barrier of courageous civil rights worker whose life has been snuffed out by the dastardly acts of bloodthirsty mobs. Difficult and painful as it is, we must walk on the days ahead with the audacious faith in the future." Now, there are several insights that one might glean from this, it seems to me, including the imperative that we never give up. The insight I want to press here is that the civil rights trajectory, the pathway to social change, is not linear. It reflects what we might call a reform retrenchment, a movement forward carried then with a movement backward. So in the rest of my time, I want to focus on these two insights: the gap between law and morality, on the one hand, and the idea that the civil rights trajectory is not a linear one, that we take one step forward, another step backward. Now, to do this, I have to confess, I'm going to have to take you to law school a little bit, just a little bit. Now, for those of you who have already been to law school, I apologize if this is a little re-traumatizing. But more seriously, I mean to discuss just a few cases. I promise to break things down and make it plain, because I want to highlight again for you the crucial gap between legality and morality on the one hand, and I want to highlight for you the importance of understanding that civil rights reform reflects this movement forward and backward that I think we need to understand. My starting point for all of this is an engagement with that peculiar institution, slavery. Slavery, the moment in which we instantiate the idea of black inferiority and white superiority. And we need to name it in precisely that way. The particular case that I want to talk about is called Dred Scott v. Stanford. Some of you might know something about this particular case. So it's a complicated case, the details of which I will spare you, but there's a part in that opinion that I want to read. They, Africans, had for more than a century been regarded as beings of an inferior order, altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in political or in social relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Justice Taney goes on to say, in this opinion, that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery. Now, this was not an exceptional moment. Slave law cases read this way. Slave law cases legitimized the idea, inscribed the idea of black inferiority. Now, there are lots of other cases in the slave law context, one more of which I want to discuss, that involves three women who are asserting their right to freedom. The case is Huggins versus Wright. And they're arguing not that they're white and therefore that they should be free. They're actually arguing that they're indigenous and they should be 3. And I'm going to embarrass my daughter and suggest that as a master's student at UCLA, she's actually written the best paper on this particular case. Earlier this morning, I spoke about implicit bias. This is an explicit bias of mine, that my daughter wrote the best paper, so indulge me that, if you will. So here's what's going on in this particular case. The women come before a court. There are masters who want to enslave them, and they say, we are free. And we're free because we are indigenous. And there are lots of cases of this sort. And I want to read to you what the court says about all of this. So, point 1, quote, nature has stamped upon the African and his descendants 2 characteristic marks besides the color of complexion, which often remain visible long after color disappears. A flat nose and a woolly head of hair. This is the court speaking. The latter of these characteristics, a woolly head of hair, disappears last of all. Of course, that's not true in my case. The woolly head of hair disappeared too soon, but I digress. So pointed is the distinction in hair, the court says, between natives of Africa and the Aborigines of America, that a man might as easily mistake the glossy, jetty clothing of an American bear for the wool of a black sheep, as the hair of an American Indian for that of an African. So whether you're on the freedom side of slavery or the slavery side of slavery, it's going to turn on hair in part. But wait, there's more. So in the context of adjudicating, the court is literally litigating people's racial identity. Is this person black? Is this person white? Is this person indigenous? The court imagines the following 3 people appearing before the court saying, I am free. So you're going to have to tell me who these people are for the court. So you have to respond. Your choices are black, white, or indigenous, right? So here's how the court describes them. Person 1 comes before me, I'm the judge. This person has a quote-unquote black complexion, has a quote-unquote flat nose, and has a quote-unquote woolly hair. Race, black, white, or indigenous. Answer? You got to say it like you mean it. Answer? I know you might feel this is politically incorrect, but you got to go there because I want you to reproduce the logic of the court. All right, that's scenario 1. Scenario 2, the court says, now imagine that a person appears before the court with quote-unquote copper complexion. Hair is quote-unquote long, black, and straight. Court doesn't provide any information about the nose. What's this person? Indian, black. Thank you, indigenous. So now you're not worried about PC-ness anymore. You're just down with the project. One more. This person appears before you. Fair complexion, brown, not woolly hair, Roman nose, pause. What is a Roman nose? Look to the right, look to the left. Who has a Roman nose? I don't know. All right, so fair complexion, brown, not woolly. Who is this person? All right, so you get the idea. So the court is engaged in the process of litigating race, not because it's some abstract thing, because to be assigned a racial body is to be situated under a system of racial hierarchy, on the bottom or on the top. So much is at stake then with respect to how these people are defined. So I want to move on and provide you with another important indication of the gap between morality and legality. So, yellow peril. How many of you have heard that term? So this brings us home. Forget about the South. This brings us right here to California, where in the 1800s, the notion was that people of Chinese descent are a yellow peril. That was the idea. And it was an idea that, again, was instantiated in law. So it resulted in exclusion laws. You cannot come to this country. In racialized naturalization laws, you cannot become a citizen. And in this particular case that I will now discuss. People versus Hall. So what's going on in this case? So a white man is convicted on the testimony of a Chinese witness. And this man says, wait a minute, you cannot convict me because the person who offered the testimony is not white. So the question becomes, is it legitimate for a person of Chinese descent to offer testimony in court against a white person? That's the fundamental question. It turns out that the relevant law includes these categories, by which I mean the law says if you're Indian, you can't testify against white. If you were mulatto, if you're black, you can't testify against white. So what would you say with respect to this particular law if you want the conviction to stay? It doesn't say anything about the Chinese, does it? Does it say anything about the Chinese? No. Do you think the conviction gets overturned? You would be wrong. So here's what the court says. This is one of my favorite arguments in all case law. It's called the Christopher Columbus mistake argument. And it all comes back to Christopher Columbus. Wait for it. Here's how it goes. Christopher Columbus made a mistake when he came to the Americas. He thought he was in Asia. Precisely because he thought he was in Asia, he called the indigenous people Indians. So the indigenous people became Indians only because Christopher Columbus made a mistake. That's point A. Point B, the people in Asia, including the Chinese, they remained Indians. They're the true Indians. So this law captures them. You laugh. This is the argument. People v. Hall, go look it up. The court also said, and by the way, just in case you're not persuaded by that argument, try this one. Chinese people are black. Why are Chinese people black? Because they're not white. So those two arguments the court rehearses to justify a system of racial hierarchy. And the court is clear, it has to justify the system. We cannot legitimize a regime that would authorize a Chinese person to testify against a white person. That's not happening in my court. Therefore, the court mobilizes these two sets of arguments to legitimize its reasoning. Subsequent to that, the legislator quickly changes this and adds Chinese to the list. But that's the logic of racial reasoning to facilitate racial subordination. All right, the civil rights cases. We know that after slavery, there is Reconstruction. And Reconstruction was an important moment. Reconstruction brought with it the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. Reconstruction brought with it the 14th Amendment that said, if you're born in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States. The 14th Amendment also said, by the way, that we all have equal protection rights. The 14th Amendment also suggests that we have due process rights. So the 14th Amendment seemed to offer this enormous promise. And then there's the 15th Amendment that says you cannot deny people the right to vote on the basis of race. And finally, there's a bunch of civil rights legislation that's passed during this time as well. So what I want to talk about for a minute is the court's engagement with civil rights legislation. The civil rights legislation is passed in the 1800s, and all it does is say you cannot discriminate against African Americans in public accommodation. It's a very modest move. It's not radical in any sense. And the court says this is unconstitutional legislation. It's unconstitutional legislation because the Constitution does not speak to private discrimination. Individuals are free to discriminate in private on the basis of race. I want to say that again. Individuals are free to discriminate on the basis of race. The Constitution has nothing to say about that. This is after Reconstruction, where we're trying to turn a page. We're trying to say we're on the right side of racial justice. And already you see what I'm calling a retrenchment, a big step backwards. Let's move now to the Jim Crow era. Do I need to tell you anything about Jim Crow? Not really. This too is a moment where blackness is marked as inferior. This too is a moment where we legitimize a regime that tips the scales in favor of whiteness. So let me talk specifically about a particular case that you may know something about. The case is Plessy versus Ferguson. Show of hands, you know something about this case. So I wonder if you know the logic of this case, because it's kind of like the logic of the People versus Hall case. So it's a case in which black people are saying separate but equal violates our equal protection rights. And the court says, no, it doesn't. Why? Because black people are being separated from white people are being separated from black people, we're treating them the same. That's the logic. If you feel stigmatized by this law, black people, it's on you. You are imposing racial stigma on yourself. The law is not stigmatizing you. The court goes on to say, if the tables were turned and white people were in this position, we wouldn't feel stigmatized by the laws. So you can already see the kind of blaming the victim, black people as complainers in this particular case. And finally, the court says, we've already said it before and we'll say it again. The Constitution will not speak to private acts of discrimination. The Constitution will not deal with societal discrimination. That's not the purpose of the Constitution. So let's fast forward to the dissent. There's a dissent in the context of the case. So I want to read the dissent. You may not be able to see it properly. And tell me if you like this dissent. So this is the justice in the case who's saying segregation is unconstitutional. And this is what he says. The white race deems itself to be the dominant race in this country, and so it is in prestige, in achievement, in education, in wealth, and in power. So I doubt not it will continue to be for all time if it remains true to its great heritage. Do you like this quote? No. Do you like this quote? No. This is the person who's saying segregation is this is supposed to be our friend, our ally. So even as you have this moment of reform, where justice is saying segregation is unconstitutional, it's also reflecting an investment in racial hierarchy, the white race as the dominant race. So I want to now end by suggesting that as we think about morality and legality and the gap between the two, as we think about the extent to which civil rights is both a movement forward and a movement backward, we need to consider what I'm going to describe as the 7 days of racial injustice. And I want to suggest that King would want us to take seriously these 7 days. So day 1 is slavery. As we discussed, slavery is a regime of violence, slavery is a regime of inhumanity, and slavery is a regime of legality. Day 2 is Reconstruction. Here we're prepared to say that slavery was wrong. After Civil War, we'll say slavery was wrong. So we formally abolish the institution. Do we engage in redistribution of any sort? Do we redistribute wealth in this moment? No. All we do is say slavery was wrong. That's an important move, but it's not enough. Let's go now to, back up. Day 3, Jim Crow. Like slavery, this is a day of violence, this is a day of inhumanity, and this is a day of legality. This is a day when we are being inscribed as altogether inferior again. Day 4, Brown v. Board of Education. We all know something about Brown. Brown is a significant case. It says segregation is unconstitutional. And we're prepared now to say that loudly and clearly. Do we engage in redistribution? Again, there's no redistribution. Day 5, I'm getting to a close. There's massive resistance to Brown. There's massive resistance to civil rights. There's massive resistance in the South, massive resistance in the North, massive resistance in courts, in the chambers of Congress, in your neighborhoods, on your school boards. Resistance, resistance, resistance. Day 6. Day 7 is the blame the victim day. This is the day that we hear, why don't they go to school? Why don't they study harder in school? Why don't they stay in school? Why are they killing each other? Why don't they get jobs? Why don't they work harder at their jobs? Why don't they get off welfare? Why are they always complaining? Why don't they stop playing the race card? Why do they get racial preferences? Now, through 1 through 7, there's been no redistribution. At best, what we do is end a formal regime. That's it. I want to suggest in closing that it's critical that we think about days 1 through 7. And I want to introduce an image that I employed this morning. So for those of you who are there, you've seen this image. For those of you who are not there, where were you? So this is the image. So I always preface it by saying, so I'm a board member of the African American Policy Forum. Part of what we try to do is engender a particular way of thinking about race. And we show this image. And we stipulate when we show this image that the cows are sick. We say the cows are sick, and then we ask, why are the cows sick? And again, if we had a discussion, we'd get 2 kinds of responses. So you focus on the cows, you say the cows are sick because they're not grazing properly, they're not drinking enough water, they're not pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. In other words, you're kind of blaming the cows. And then you say, well, maybe it's not the cows, maybe it's the farmer, right? The farmer just doesn't like the cow. The farmer likes the chicken, the farmer's a cowcist, right? Like a racist. So you blame the chicken, or you blame the cows, or you blame the farmers. You get the idea. If I pull back the frame, what do you see? You see toxicity, you see environmental degradation, and you understand that the cows are going to be sick. So it's not about the cows pulling themselves by their bootstraps, they're going to be sick. It's not just about whether the farmer is a nasty little cowcist, they're going to be sick. What I'm suggesting is days 1 through 7 is the broader backdrop that we need to have in mind. And my surmise is that King thought about this. So here's a quote that King delivered in the context of articulating his High of a Dream speech. And here's where I'll end. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our great republic wrote the magnificent words in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall here. This note was a promise to all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as our citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring her sacred obligation, America has given the Negro a bad check, a check that has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity in this nation. So we have come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. So when we think of King, it seems to me, we belittle him and we belittle his legacy when all we do is speak of, I have a dream. We need to think in terms of King's radical vision, a vision of love, a vision of peace, and a vision of community to be sure, but also and crucially, a vision of accountability, a vision of reckoning, and a vision of social transformation. Thank you all very much.